Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Radio Sofia. Radio Sofia is a platform operating on the Discord mobile app or website to host discussions, talks, movie and book reviews, story and poetry recitals, etc. on socio-economic and political issues. The platform intends to bring academicians and non-academicians together in one place for a dialogue and to educate each other. In one such attempt this week, the 16th and 17th May 2020, we are discussing the topic Migration and Work in the Context of India. I am Kranti Nanduri, a PhD student at IIM Calcutta, and I am the moderator for these discussions. Yesterday, the 16th May, Ms. Srujana Boddu, a PhD student at MIDS, has given us a brief introduction to the topic Migration and Work. She has explained to us about migration, different types of and different patterns of migration, and she has highlighted in particular about distress migration, that is migration in search of wage work in the absence of alternative livelihood opportunities. Today we have with us Professor Mritiunjoy MOhanty to talk on the topic the crisis of migration and the road ahead. Professor MOhanty is a full-time professor in economics group at Indian Institute of Management Calcutta. His work broadly falls in the areas of macroeconomics and political economy. Some of his writings focus on the topics of globalization and economic growth, political economy of agrarian transition, structural change, and labor market dynamics, etc. He is also an economic advisor of NTUI, New Trade Union Initiative. It's a great pleasure for me to host Professor MOhanty on Radio Sofia. Professor MOhanty, thank you very much for readily accepting our invitation and joining us today.
NTUI, but the views that I'm going to express just now are purely personal. They implicate neither the NTUI nor the brand in them. So what I will try and do in the time, so we'll go to say 6:35 or so about half an hour. I'll speak. So Kranti, my friends tell me that once I'm given a mic, I don't let go. So
Okay.
My suggestion is that you keep a close watch on the clock and let me know when I'm 5 minutes to finish, and I'll wrap it up.
Yes, sure.
Right. So I'm assuming that either I'll be so unclear that there'll be many questions asking me to explain, or I'll be so provocative that I'll have many questions asking me to explain. In either instance, that there is some point to leaving some part of the talk towards the for open discussions. So with these few remarks, I'd also like to say that I'm an economist, and so by training I'm taught to abstract. And so there's, of course, there's a bunch of economists who like working with data and then coming up with data. But as a discipline, we're told that we should be able to take facts and abstract. And so many of and the discipline itself sometimes sort of gets so carried away with the notion of abstracting that it behaves as if history, sociology, anthropology, other social sciences, which deal with sort of hard and muddy and not easy to interpret facts, that they are somehow not a part of this abstraction process. But I'm also a Marxist, and because I'm a Marxist, I have also been taught that you move from the concrete to the abstract, and from the abstract back to the concrete. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that it's important to abstract, therefore theory is very important. But a theory which doesn't explain the world around it is little point. But the fact that theory explains the world around it has completely non-ideological connotations. There's good theory, there's bad theory. So even though I have a completely ideological framing, at least I try and not allow that get interfering with my understanding of what good theory is. So if there's a good good piece of theorization, I take it as that it explains a certain slice of reality, which I may or may not agree with the interpretation. So therefore, it's a good way of keeping a check on how the same reality is read by somebody else, so, and also how that in itself it should force me to get into re-examining is why I might be saying what I'm saying. So all this in terms of method. So, because people who we try and invisibilize and people who exist have ways of bursting our bubbles when we least expect it. So it's in that sense that a lot of people woke up to the reality of migrant labor and the role that it plays in explaining India's growth story, really the day after the lockdown was announced. So even those who knew that migrant labor exists didn't seem to understand. Now, for those who've been working with migrant labor, and there have been people like Jan Bremen and people like Ravi Srivastav, and for this has been bread and butter. I mean, they've been crying themselves hoarse that migrant labor is the under-theorized, under-discussed part of Indian growth experience. So in that respect, the attention that it's getting from us and from the rest of society is long overdue. But how important is it phenomenon? Why should we at all think about it? Should one think about it purely in terms of the fact that this is a set of people who are unfortunate that they're there, and we should be charitable in what we do for them, or should we think of them as being the linchpin of this process of growth? For the most part, even today, those of us who live in houses that have balconies believe that we should be charitable. What I want to end with is that we live in balconies because they toil in the ways that they do. So, so just to give you a sense of magnitudes, right? Just so that we get a hang of why we should be worrying about any of this, right? So when you look at the 11-12 total employment, it's about 272 million. Urban employment was 136 million. Rural employment was about 336 million. I must say that before I forget, my PhD students of recent vintage have been extraordinarily generous with me. They've been very kind in allowing me to allow my own research concerns shape their research questions. So, so a lot of my own the areas around which I've been thinking have allowed it's been possible to explore that in much greater detail because they chose to work in the areas which are of interest to me. So in what I am going to say specifically, some part of it relates to work which Anjali is doing, Anjali Rajan, under my supervision. She's going to submit early July, and some of the issues that we'll deal with, particularly which is nature of the Lewis transformation, are things that she's looked at, and that allows us to make somewhat more definitive statements. Similarly, what Srujana did, which was much more macroeconomics, allowed me to look at the nature of private investment in India. Work which Kranti is doing, which is looking at the nature of informality from the side not of labor but of accumulation, is an old interest of mine, where I think the informality is a part of the accumulation process, much in line with how Brahmin would look at it from the side of labor. And finally, what Swati is doing, which is looking at the capital goods sector, is my attempt to understand what is the nature of Indian capitalism in how it handles complex jobs. So it's a research agenda that of my own, which tries to understand India's capitalist growth in its multifacetedness, particularly in a comparative context. So I just thought I'd bring that in to say that a lot of what I'm saying is shaped by work which my very generous graduate students are doing or have done. So to come back to the story, so the 212 total employment was 472 million, urban was 136 million, and rural was 336 million. Of this, only 88 million, 88 out of 472 is regular employment. That is things like jobs like what we hold, what we all aspire to, and so on and so forth. 93% of this workforce is informal, and that level of informality is actually very high. Even if we leave farmers out, it's quite. Of this total employment, 48% is in agriculture, 52% is in non-agriculture. 11-12 was the first year in which India less than 50% of employment in agriculture, and everybody went to town about the fact that, the Lewis movement had arrived, and from now on India would be driven by the generation of non-agricultural employment, and so on and so forth, which we'll discuss in greater detail a little later. So urban industry is about 48 million, urban services about 80 million. Sorry. So, and the current, and this was 2011-12 figures, the 17-18 urban informal employment is about 150 million. All right? Of this, about 90 million is waged. Of this 150 million, which is I request you to keep in mind, the segment that Ravi Srivastava characterizes as vulnerable circular migrants is in the range of 115 to 140 million. So he distinguishes three types of migration. One is long-term permanent migration, and the other is semi-permanent circular migration, and the third is short-term circular migration. Circular being the fact that you leave your point of destination, come and work somewhere else, and then go back to the point of destination. So you go back to your where you come from, the point of origin, not destination. Sorry. And what is equally important, that about of this 115 million, roughly half is not captured in. So I was saying, I'll just go back. So I was saying that roughly urban informal sector is about 150 million. Using NSS data, we can calculate it's 150 million in 2017-18, of which 90 million is unwaged. Now, Ravi Srivastava categorizes these what he calls vulnerable migrants. He categorizes migrants in three types. One is long-term permanent migrants. Second is semi-permanent circular migrants. Third is short-term circular migrants. The thing about circular migrants is that they leave the point of origin to the point of destination, and at some point return to the point of origin. So some will return in 2-3 months, some will return in 2-3 years, but the point is that they come back, and it's that returning which makes it very complicated to theorize about them using standard development paradigms. So the roughly 40 million, 40 million is what the NSS census would say is about permanent migrants. So our workforce of 472 million, 40 million is about 10%. And, so people say, oh, that's not a lot. But the estimate that Ravi is putting out, and I think it's a fairly robust estimate. Of course, we can fight about it, but you're not going to get figures that are very, very different. So the estimates that Ravi is putting out, total of short-term circular migrants and semi-permanent circular migrants is 115 to 140 million. So if you take 120 million as total short-term semi-permanent circular migrants, now there is no way you can use the Harris-Todaro model to explain this. There's just no way. So your existing ways in which you think about migration in mainstream development economics don't give you a handle on this. Right? There are other ways of thinking about it which can give you a handle, and we'll come to that in a moment. But that's very important. And it's also important to remember that of this, it's about 60 million is not captured. So if you want to think of it, you have to think of it in terms of the fact that say about total workforce is 470. You add about 60 million to that, right? So total workforce would be about 530. Now, this total 120 million includes intrastate, intrastate migrants and interstate migrants. Yeah, so people move within the state from the place of origin to place of destination, and then people move outside the state from place of destination, from place of origin to place of destination. Okay, and if you look at total seasonal circular migrants, if you look at total seasonal circular migrants, the states that come up on the table, the states that come up on the table are Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Gujarat. So you get a mix of low-income states and up-income states that you would argue that everybody uses it. But the moment you come to interstate migration, that you take out the intra bit of it, right? We take out the intra bit of it, the interstate ranking list goes as Bihar, UP, MP, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa. All right. So what you get, is that migration, interstate migration is driven by migration from poor to rich states. Now, there's one chapter that Anjali is working on, which is sort of looking at NSS data and looking at what is happening to structural changes, whether the Lewis transformation has happened on. Remember that I've said in 11-12, agriculture is 42%, 48%. 48% of the workforce, and everybody argued that the Lewis transformation has happened. Now, when we break it up state-wise, there are two remarkable things that emerge. First, that in the well-to-do states, the Lewis transformation has happened. Second, in the poor state, the Lewis transformation has not happened. And what distinguishes the poor from the rich states is levels of agricultural productivity. That is, poorer states tend to be much lower, have much less efficient productive agriculture as opposed to rich states. So the outlier for this is West Bengal, where actually agricultural productivity is high, but its SDP per capita SDP is low. And the other outlier is Maharashtra. In the rich states, Maharashtra has not seen a Lewis transformation, even though it's a rich state. So you have to think about inequalities and so on and so forth. You have to keep that drives this interstate. So let me complicate the story a little more for you. Almost all the states that I've listed as the poor states, which are the labor sending states, which are all the poor states that are labor sending states, have total fertility ratios that are higher than the national average, except West Bengal and Odisha. So Bihar has a fertility ratio of 3.2, where the average for India is 2.2. UP has a fertility ratio of 3, Madhya Pradesh has 2.7, and so on and so forth, right? And the rich states have all fertility ratios which are lower than 2.1. Now, 2.1 is important too. In India, 2.2 is the average. 2.1 is your replacement rate, which is at 2.1, your population stabilizes. Beyond 2.1, as it falls below 2.1, your population will begin to not to slow down, but to shrink. And as the population contracts, the labor force will contract. So what you're getting is poor states which are doing very poorly in agriculture, where the Lewis transformation hasn't happened, sending labor to rich states which have seen a Lewis transformation, which have seen a decline in fertility rates, where labor force rates of growth are going to, in the near future, going to start declining quite significantly. Now, what you would expect, therefore, what your supply and demand tells you, as your labor force rates of growth contract, you should have wages rising. But, and this is the key, extensive transfer of labor from poor states to rich states holds down wage growth. So what you get is a process of growth, which is centered on labor force flexibility, which is informalization, and labor force control. And this, so remember the fact that productivity is rising in the rich states. Their agricultural productivity is high, the non-agricultural productivity is high, the STPs are high, the per capita incomes are growing. So if productivity is rising and you're holding down wage growth because of transfer of labor, then, other things being equal, profits grow faster, inequality grows. So So I can see from my computer clock that I have another 5-6 minutes. So let me begin to wind this up. So that's one part of the story. One part of the story is that India's urbanization process, where you've got cities in developed country, in parts of India, but also in Kolkata and so on, but in Chennai, in Bangalore, in Pune, in Mumbai, in Delhi, is the growth is driven by circular migrant process. Now, these circular migrants are, by and large, tend to be lower caste, Dalit, Adivasis, Muslims, and in the lower deciles of the population. One of the things about migration is supposed to be, which again is overturned in this instance, it's supposed to be that the better off migrate because their costs of migration. Now, when you look at this what Ravi Srivastava characterizes as vulnerable migrants, now his data also tells you that the poorer you are, the lower your caste, etc., 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 you are likely to go further away from your point of origin in search of work. So this group of vulnerable migrants, which is fed urban India's growth, all the people who live in balconies and clap grow on the back of migrant labor, which does not get a living wage. And so this migrant labor force is more likely to be Dalit, more likely to be Adivasi, more likely to be lower OBC, more likely to be poor than permanent migrant. If you're a permanent migrant, the likelihood is that you are upper caste or upper OBC and so on. So when the one thing that liberal India wanted to run away, has always wanted to run away from, is the reality of caste. When neoliberal reforms happened, people felt, oh, urbanization, Taristodaro, and the rest of it will take care of caste and so on and so forth. What this tells you is that it is the reality of caste and how that caste shapes India's laboring millions, which shapes India's workforce. And this workforce, 93% of which is informal, they want even more flexibility. They want even more flexibility. So when you see this and you factor in the way the lockdown was imposed, it tells you that policies are made by people who have no clue about how the Indian economy functions, how the Indian economy's labor market functions. Policies are made for people whose houses have balconies and they can clap from there. But this labor for vulnerable migrant population, in anywhere upwards of 100 million people, is a set of people that got affected by the slowdown, by the lockdown, and their misery is what you see. But anybody who says that they need charity just doesn't get it. You just need that they, like everybody else who labors, should get a living wage. Now I'll close very quickly with something else again, which I want to hopefully we'll get time to go back to, is that I opened by saying I'm a Marxist, but because I'm a Marxist, I also don't hold Marx as gospel. So in Marx, the bourgeoisie emerges as this heroic character, that is the most progressive force which moves economies and societies forwards. Because now we know that urbanization is not the only route. Bourgeoisies may not be always progressive, that there are other routes to growth. Rural industrialization is an important route to growth, etc., etc., etc. But there is a debate around the high road and the low road to capitalism. The high road to capitalism is where capitalist growth happens with wage growth accompanying productivity growth. The low road happens when capitalism grows, there is growth, but productivity growth does not reflect in wage growth. And interestingly enough, the country that has taken the low road to capitalism is the United States. And sociologists will argue that the United States has taken the low road to capitalism because slavery has left an enduring imprint in the way American capitalism has been shaped. So it's not just the American bourgeoisie, but the nature of slavery and the choices that the bourgeoisie makes because of slavery that leads it to ways in which it looks at othering it and so on and so forth. So I will argue that, and this is an argument again that Ravi had made and Jan Bremen has made, not quite in this way, but nonetheless, similar argument, which says that unless we take on the question of caste and the inequality that the caste structure, imposes through which capitalism works, you'll never ever get an inclusive capitalist growth. I'll end with the words of Kanchalaya Shepherd, who said, in the context of this current lockdown, that India's upper castes have been practicing social distancing for millennia. So they're completely happy with the lockdown. So much for balconies and so much for clapping. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor MOhanty.
Karthik, hi.
Hi, sir. How are you? I have one question. So I was wondering, now that the migrant laborers are going back home, and for the foreseeable future, we are likely to see that they'll continue to stay at home because they may not be welcome back in the places where they used to find work, given that they'll have to continue staying in a quarantine once they return and so on and so forth. How do you see the unemployment situation in India playing out over the next few months to the next few years?
Thank you for asking this question. I meant to address this, but I ran out of time. So let me say this. And what makes the way the lockdown was imposed so particularly distressing and unfortunate is that there are two aspects to it. First is the loss of jobs, and as any macroeconomist will tell you, jobs once lost don't necessarily always come back. So irrespective irrespective of whether or not people want them back, the jobs they have lost may not be back. Number one. Number two, the poor states that I listed where you've got migration coming from, for them, this group of circular migrants are very important in terms of their consumption. They all send money back home. So there are two things that have happened. The nature of the way in which the lockdown was imposed is meant that the meager savings of people that they had have almost all been used up in trying to get back home. Second, because they have lost jobs and they're going back, there is no addition of remittance to their consumption basket back home. So what we'd see is what in economics we call a consumption shock. So I anticipate, therefore, that unless there is something that is very seriously done to shore this up in labor sending states, either by extending MTR, NREGA, or wage subsidies and so on and so forth, you're going to have very serious unemployment issues in these states. Remember the fact that one of the reasons why they migrate out of these states is because there aren't any jobs in the states, in agriculture or in non-agriculture. So it's that reality that we're going back to states where we don't have work, which you have to factor in. So I would say that purely for the labor sending states, there's an issue of unemployment, issue of very slowdown in consumption growth, and therefore what happens to the macroeconomy. And I'll just close with the fact that for labor sending states, what happens, unfortunately, and this is something Jean Drèze has pointed out, is that suddenly there's labor scarcity. Because you want to open up, but you can't open up. You can't open up where there isn't any labor. So that again restricts and constrains you. So when an economy has seen both a supply side shock and a consumption shock, it really complicates the macroeconomic system.
Right, Karthik, I hope that answers your question, sir. So we have one question from Shika.
Yeah.
Any suggestions on policy reforms to government in shortest time possible for inclusivity of these migrant laborers? And also Bhavna has a question. So it says, recently government has come up with a measure of linking Aadhaar card to ration cards to ensure a better PDS system. Will this be helpful to them, or what other measures may be taken? So maybe both questions are in a sense about policy measures. What are in place and what could be taken?
So what I will say is first to answer Shika's question. Right. Purely in terms of policy measures, the first thing to do is enable states to chalk out their own policy responses. States don't have money. States don't have money because there's a collapse of tax revenues. Now, the finance ministers today has said that states can run deficit from 3%, take it up to 5%, but 5% is linked with achieving certain kinds of policies that the government of India wants them to, and second is that it's ways and means advance. Now, it's basically an overdraft. An overdraft is short-term borrowing. What would have helped states much more is allowing the states to borrow from the Reserve Bank using long-dated bonds. Using long-dated bonds and give them the flexibility of deciding how they want to spend this money, because each state faces very, very different situations. So labor sending states face one kind of situation, labor receiving states face another kind of situation. There is the issue of what you want to do with COVID and how to deal with it. So the immediate response is that you should allow states the flexibility to design their own exit strategies, number one. Number two is to ensure the fact that you begin to spend money as quickly as possible to bring up demand that's gone out of the system. Expenditure multipliers are much, much better and higher than going through a liquidity. So that's the answer to Shika. The answer to the other question is, it's a good thing to make your Aadhaar cards and your PDS cards portable. It's a great idea. But the point is, that's in the long term. It's not in the short term. In the short term, unless and until I do something to take care of the demand that's gone out of the system because of the lockdown and because of what had happened earlier, that is not going to help with the problems that migrants face. So you need a short-term response which allows for reflation. And the reflation is very important. The reflation is very important because that reflation of demand, which allows what SMEs to kick back in, to grow. Because the SMEs are the other things that have been very badly hammered. Professor Khanna and I, Professor Shil Khanna and I have written about this elsewhere, that even prior to this, so, the SME sector had been hit by demonetization and GST, and now you have the lockdown. So, I mean, for example, in Tamil Nadu, in Coimbatore, and there is an engineering unit which uses half the people from Tamil Nadu and half people from UP. So tomorrow, unless there is a return of migrant labor back, how are you going to get this to to run at full capacity, even if there was demand? So it's very odd in the way that today your labor market is national. Today your supply chain is national. And the national labor market and the national supply chain are linked to each other. But policy is made in a way in which neither understand the supply chain nor the labor market.
Right. So there's another question.
Yeah.
So Ways and Means Advance relaxation has already been announced by RBI. Do you still suggest further relaxation in Ways and Means Advance as demanded by few states?
No, what I'm saying is, a Ways and Means is an overdraft, which is say that it's short-term borrowing. That is, in short-term borrowing, it also needs to be paid back in the short term. So I'll borrow for 3 months, 6 months, I can roll it over, but eventually I have to start repaying it. And that state repayment capacities, as of the moment, have been hammered even worse than the federal government, central government's repayment capacities. So ideally, what you should do is allow the RBI to buy long-dated state bonds, municipal bonds, and so this is what the U.S. Federal Reserve has done, by the way. The U.S. Federal Reserve has gone out and bought municipal bonds and so on and so forth, and pushes in money into the hand. So I'm saying that it allows, if you allow them to borrow in the medium to long term, some part of it, some part in the short and some part in the medium to long term, then it allows them to spend in similar sorts of ways, because there's spending that can be targeted, spending that can be targeted at immediately. There's spending that be targeted in the medium term, spending that's targeted in the long term, all of which go towards sort of getting out of this exit, getting out of this mess.
Right. Okay, Karthik has another question. If the government were to cancel out components of salary, example HRA, DA, etc., and ask landowners to waive off rents in lieu of some form of compensation, such as waiver of property tax, etc., would the multiplier effect improve, making any infusion of cash into the system go longer?
I didn't understand why waiving off of will improve the multiplier effect. Why waiving off of rents, etc.? I didn't understand that.
Karthik, would you mind
Yeah. So
elaborating?
basic. Yeah. So I was just thinking about it of solutions. So if the government were to cancel out, say, the HRA component of our salaries in the formal sector, you cancel out HRA and ask all offices, manufacturers to not give that part. So, say a 15% reduction in the total outflow of cash from any company happens. And in exchange, the recipients of this HRA, which is in effect landowners, you tell them that they don't charge this money to the people for a duration of, say, 3 months or 6 months. And in exchange, the government promises to give them some other form of compensation over a duration of time in the form of a property tax waiver or some form of compensation as well.
Right. Okay. So two very quick things, Karthik. First, the people who rent out to people in the top 2-3% bracket are not the same people who rent out to migrant labor. So that's number one. You can't. There's no way that you can cut this and say that you give them that waiver. It doesn't work like that. Second, what we know is that the multiplier effect of a tax cut of any kind is much, much lower than a direct expenditure in induction of the same magnitude. So I can spend that money and my budget and my deficit will increase. I can cut taxes by the same amount and my deficit will increase. So in both cases, my deficit increases. But the multiplier effect of the expenditure is substantially higher than the multiplier effect of a tax cut. So anything that takes demand out of the system today, however it may be, is not a good idea for the system as it stands. You've got a very complicated system where there is huge demand shortfalls and there are supply shocks. Now, so actually, as you navigate this, as you bring supply back, you are going to hit supply constraints sooner than you think. So you have to work in ways in which, as demand comes back, supply comes back online.
Right. So there's another question. Yeah, so the question is, there's so much talk about liquidity measures. Are continuous increase in liquidity enhancement needed? He means all announcement by RBI talking about liquidity problem and saying measures for enhancement of liquidity. So, yeah.
Well, actually, the infusion of liquidity when there's a liquidity overhang makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. The second, what they call the LTRO, where the RBI went in and sold long-term bonds, sold or bought? Hello, yeah, whichever. Infused a lot of liquidity into the system, which immediately came back as a reverse repo transaction into the RBI's own coffers. So what that tells you is that banks do not know what to want. They don't want to do anything with this money. The RBI released that money into the system, then they came back and put it back. If the RBI say that we have parked it, it's safer with you than with him. So there's a very high degree of risk aversion. So in forcing banks to lend when there is very high degree of risk aversion, infusing more liquidity into the system just does not make any sense. I'm very sorry, somebody has taken that figure. How much do you think we should exceed this? How much do you think the budget deficit could go up by? Oh, okay, we are 3.5, maybe we can go up to 5. And that's where they've just clocked it off without thinking. So the effort seems twofold. How much actual expenditure increase comes in, And as you will see in many in business papers, out of the 20 lakh, very little translates into actual expenditure increase. See, if you're not going to do that, you're just going to deepen this mess. So already the government of India is saying in March, industrial output contracted by 16%. In March, only the last week of March, there was a lockdown. So what is going to happen in April? What's going to happen in May? And anybody who thinks that we're going to come out of this with some V-shaped recovery, this V-shaped recovery has been doing the rounds ever since the 2007-8 global crisis, when a liquidity injection meant that by 10-11, after 9, by 2010, economies were on high growth, back on high growth path. When you impaired the supply capacities of an economy, which you have in this demonetization, GST, and now the lockdown, when you have impaired supply capacities, when you have done to migrant labor what you have done, which you forced them out in this way, there's no way you're going to have a V-shaped recovery. And already the government of India was saying we're going to go to 6%. So V-shaped recovery taking where to 6%?
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Mohanty. This has been a wonderful talk, and we've got to know a lot more about migration and the types of migration and the economic logic and the way in which we should approach the issue. So thank you very much for this talk and for the time. I hope you continue to support us in this initiative, and yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and I will try and always come when you do invite again. And right. I hope it was useful to all of you.
Yes,
and
sir.
Wasn't too much like a class.
No, it wasn't like a class. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please keep following Radio Sofia. It's on Discord server, and it is also on Facebook to keep up to date about the lectures and the discussions that we will hold. Thank you very much. Good night.